So for topic 2, the big idea is continuing to look at fossils here. We actually saw these first 3 before. So 1, what are altered remains? 2, what are unaltered remains? 3, what are trace fossils? Okay, we've seen those last topic. What are the 4 main types of altered remains? How do fossils tell us about the Earth's history? And what is the Burgess Shale? Okay, so remember last time we kind of said this step is the most important step. Step 3 here, this is really what makes or breaks if this is going to be a fossil or not, right? Step 2 is important. It should get buried, but not everything that gets buried becomes a fossil. Step 3 really needs to happen to make a fossil, okay? So today we're going to look at how does that step 3 happen? So today's really about how can step 3 happen and what kinds of fossils can be made based on how step 3 occurs. So first, we're going to look at altered remains. Remember, altered remains do show you the structures of the organism, but you're not literally looking at the organism, right? It's been preserved. The shape of it has been preserved. So it's a little bit like a photograph, right? If you saw a photo of me, you would say, yeah, I'm definitely looking at a preservation of Mr. Maxwell, right? But I can't touch him. If I touch this photo, I'm not actually touching his face, right? That's kind of the idea with altered remains. This truly is the shape of an ammonite. However, if you touch this, you're not touching the actual shell of an ammonite. So altered remains. So it's like a photo. It really is what the organism looked like. Okay, but it's not actually the organism. We're going to look at 4 main types of altered remains. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at are molds and casts. So have you ever made paper mache? That's kind of what molds and casts are like, right? So when you make paper mache, you blow up the balloon, you stick it in the newspaper and glue, you let the newspaper and glue kind of harden, and then later the balloon gets popped and the shape is still preserved in the hardened newspaper and glue, right? That's pretty much exactly what happens in a mold and cast. So an animal with something hard, maybe it's its bones, maybe it's its shell or an exoskeleton, like if it's a bug, okay? It's buried in sediment, and then the sediment hardens. So this organism has died, it's been buried. There's steps 1 and 2. Step 3 is going to happen when those sediments harden around it, right? Like the newspaper and glue hardening around the balloon in paper mache. So they're buried in sediments. The sediments then harden. And then as groundwater kind of flows through the sediment, so groundwater is just water that runs through the ground, it will over time kind of dissolve the organism's remains, right? So its shells or whatever will get dissolved. But the sediment's already hardened around it. So just like paper mache, if we then stumble upon this, there'll kind of be this empty little hole that's shaped exactly like whatever organism that was in there when the sediment hardened. So that is how we make a mold or a cast. So again, is this actually the ammonite? No, but it's like a photo of the ammonite, right? So none of the ammonite is actually left there. It's all been dissolved probably millions of years ago, but that is really exactly what an ammonite would have looked like. It's just that if we were to touch this, we wouldn't literally be touching an ammonite. The second type of altered remains we're going to look at is something called carbonization. We're going to learn in the next unit that all living things contain carbon. In fact, you might have already known that, right? But carbonization is this process by which some living thing that's dead and buried, right? Step 1, step 2, gets squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And pretty much everything, all the organic compounds, hey, remember that from chemistry? Okay. They get removed by so much pressure and heat. Essentially, everything gets squeezed out of it except this thin, thin film of carbon. Okay. It's essentially like turning a dead organism into a stamp, right? You squeeze it and squeeze it and squeeze it so much, all the compounds get squeezed out. All that's left is this thin little film of carbon. So you can see it here in plants or here in a fish. You've essentially turned a living thing into coal here, a thin layer of coal, because carbon is what coal is made of. So again, you can see how it's like a photo of the organism, right? That is not the fish, but it gives a very good outline of what the fish looked like. This is not the plant, but it gives a very good outline of what the plant looked like, right? This is just a thin layer of carbon. It is not the actual plant's cells. But by looking at it, we can definitely actually see this was a plant, right? A plant's remains have been altered, but we can study them here. The third type of altered remain we're going to look at is petrification. Like if you're petrified, right? You're scared stiff. Well, these things are stiff. They're just dead, so they're probably not scared. This is a fossil in which the entire cellular structure, so every single cell in its body, more or less, of the organism has been replaced by minerals. Okay, so every single thing that was on this organism when it died has been replaced by some type of rock or mineral. Okay, so by whatever process, minerals have kind of leached in, started to replace the cells, and now this ammonite that used to be made of tissues and muscle and bone, right, has now become mineral, right? Mineral lasts way longer than organic material, than bone and cellular structures, right? And so this is preserved forever. And once we find this, again, that is no longer an ammonite. It is rock that is shaped like this ammonite that used to be alive. And so those are altered remains. It gives a very good picture of what it looked like. It's just that if you touch that, you're not actually touching the cells of an ammonite. This one is quite related to petrification. It's the last one we're going to look at for altered remains. Permineralization. So per essentially means partial. This is basically partial petrification. So some stuff gets replaced with minerals, but not the entire cellular structure. Okay. So just some organic structures, things like bone, shells, woody tissue, things that are kind of spongy and absorbent, those get replaced by minerals, usually because water can get into there really well. And if that water has minerals in it, it can slowly start to replace those tissues. Okay. Replaced by minerals instead of the entire organism, like with petrification. So probably if you go to like the Royal Tyrrell Museum where they have tons of dinosaur fossils, most of the ones you're looking at are examples of permineralization, right? Because the structure of the entire dinosaur has not been preserved, but usually what do you see? You see dinosaur skeletons. So bones are very likely to get mineralized, and so that's why we have a lot of skeleton type fossils. The bones get replaced with minerals, and then those last a very long time. But again, those are not dinosaur bones that you're looking at here. Those are minerals that have replaced dinosaur bones so that they are in the shape of them. Okay. If you touch that, you are not touching dinosaur bone, you are touching rock shaped like dinosaur bone because these are all examples of altered remains. Now we're going to look at unaltered remains. Okay. Unaltered remains are pretty cool, pretty rare because it's hard to keep things intact for this long, but they do exist. These are okay. So the actual cells of the organism as it was when it died, however many millions of years ago. So unaltered remains, there's really kind of only one way to get it. There's different ways you can get mummified. However, we kind of call all of the ways to get unaltered remains, for the most part, mummification. Okay. So this can only occur if the organism dies in an environment where nothing else can survive, right? Why is that necessary? Why do you have to die somewhere where nothing else can survive if you're going to get preserved? Well, yeah, because then nothing can break you down, right? Living things are what breaks dead stuff down. So if there's no living stuff, you can't get broken down, right? Because then nothing can decompose it. So this, you can see why this is pretty rare, right? There's living stuff pretty much everywhere on Earth. So you have to die in a pretty special place to end up as a mummy, okay? So things like very cold temperatures, very dry conditions, because all living things need water, right? Or very little oxygens, for example, in amber or in tar pits. Okay, so this brings me to a cool example. You know what? Do you recognize this guy? Pretty big news when it happened. Okay, so these remains were discovered at Suncor in 2011. This is actually widely regarded, like worldwide, as the best preserved dinosaur remains ever discovered anywhere on Earth, right here from Fort McMurray. Pretty cool, right? Look at this. There were remnants of the dinosaur's skin still intact. Remember, the last dinosaur went extinct 65 million years ago. This is skin that we could reach out and touch. And if you were touching it, you were literally touching that dinosaur's skin, not rock shaped like skin, the actual skin from 65 million years ago. Okay. So obviously, this thing was buried in an environment where no decomposers could survive. Okay, here's some example of some insects in amber. You might have seen this from like Jurassic Park. Okay, Jurassic Park went a little overboard with it, but insects getting mummified in amber does happen all the time. We've actually found birds even mummified in amber. So how does it work? Well, a few million years ago, an ant-looking thing crawls up a tree. It gets stuck in the sap, and the sap hardens into amber. Obviously, nothing can really live in the amber, right? There's no oxygen in there to breathe. So if there's nothing that can live in there, you can't get decomposed, you get preserved. Okay, so here's some insects mummified in amber. Pretty cool. If you were to break it open and touch that ant, you would actually be touching the ant's tissues. See the difference between unaltered and altered? So that's why I say it's like a photo versus the real thing, right? If you reach out and touch a photo of someone, you're not actually touching them. But if you reach out and touch them, you're touching them, obviously. Okay. Here's a really cool one: a woolly mammoth that was mummified in ice. Okay. Ice can preserve really well. It can cause mummifications because if it's cold enough, nothing can live in that ice, right? So nothing can eat you, nothing can break you down, specifically decomposers like bacteria and small insects, right? So that is hair, that is wool, mammoth hair. Okay. If you reach out and touch that, you're touching that mammoth's hair. It is an unaltered remain. Mammoths went extinct tens of thousands of years ago, right? So pretty incredible that the hair is still on it. Okay, the third kind of overarching, we've looked at altered remains, we've looked at unaltered remains. In both, we were at least looking at the structure of the organism itself, whether it was actually the structure or just kind of a snapshot of the structure. In trace fossils, we don't actually see the structure of the organism, but we see evidence of it. Okay, so not the organism itself, but evidence of it. So, for example, preserved footprints, right? Burrows, nests, wastes like fossilized poop, right? That counts as trace fossils. These are some, I know these kind of look like dirt bike tracks, but they're actually little footprints from something called a trilobite, which has little legs. You can kind of see it scuttle, scuttle, scuttle along here, right? Pretty cool. Okay, so these still have to get preserved. Okay, those are hardened. So all that stuff still needs to happen. It still needs to be preserved somehow. Sediments need to harden to kind of save the shape of it. Your footsteps from last summer in the mud are already gone, and it's only been 1 year, right? Because nothing happened to preserve them. So these ankylosaur footprints from 65 million years ago, again, they needed some kind of process to help them be preserved. So it's still a fossil. What can fossils tell us about the history of the Earth? Well, so remember, paleo means old, right? So paleoecology. Ecology means the study of ecosystems. Okay, so paleoecology means the study of old ecosystems. So by studying fossils, we can learn about other organisms in the ecosystem, right? We can learn, okay, it looks like these guys were hunted by these guys because we found tooth marks on their bones from this organism or whatever, right? The social nature, herds, nesting behaviors. If you find a whole bunch of one organism in one area, you know they were probably a herd organism. Whereas if you always find them alone, they were probably kind of a lone wolf, right? Nesting behaviors. So we can tell, okay, this thing seemed to really raise its young a lot because we always find the youth with an adult. They're never alone. Or these things seem to just go out of the nest right away and be adults because they're always kind of independent, right? Even when they're babies. Adaptation. So one of the big ones we can do is, for example, we find a lot of dinosaurs that have very flat teeth, like the ones at the back of your mouth, right? Those are really good for grinding up plants. So we say, okay, looks like this dinosaur was probably a herbivore. It's adapted to eat plants. It's a herbivore, we bet, right? Boom, just by looking at its teeth, we kind of figure that. Whereas ones with really sharp teeth for ripping meat, we say this looks like a carnivore. So this thing must have been a predator. It also allows us to piece together evolutionary history. So by looking at different fossils, we can kind of say, huh, this one from a few million years after this one does have some common features, but it started to change. And so by looking at that, we can start to say, there must have been changes on Earth happening that led to these changes in these organisms happening. Paleogeography, we can tell by looking at fossils. So again, paleo means old, geography, well, geography means geography, right? Say Earth's surface. So the study of the Earth's old surface. So remember how we were talking about how we found tropical fossils in Antarctica? Well, that tells us about the old geography of the Earth. It tells us that Antarctica can't always have been at the South Pole. It used to be somewhere nice, right? Remember, it used to be by Australia. Contributes to our idea of how the Earth's history has looked, right? Sea levels, if we find marine fossils in places that are now inland, we can say sea levels probably used to be higher, or at least this tectonic plate was in a bit of a different position. Elevations, again, right? If at the tops of mountains where it's way too cold now for plants to survive, we find plant fossils, we can kind of put together that this used to be not as high. This mountain didn't used to be so high up that it was so cold. Or leads me into our next point, paleoclimatology. So old paleo. Climatology means climate. So again, the type of organism thriving tells us about the climate at the time. So okay, there are advantages to being cold-blooded and advantages to being warm-blooded. Cold-blooded organisms do really well when it's hot because they don't need to expend energy heating themselves up. However, they do very poorly when it's cold because they can't heat themselves up if they need to, so they die out, right? So by looking at looks like at this time in the history of the Earth, there were a lot of cold blooded organisms. We can kind of say, well, the Earth must have been warm then, right? And vice versa, if there's a lot of warm blooded organisms, we can kind of say, looks like the Earth must have been pretty cold then because warm blooded organisms were doing way better than cold blooded, right? Kind of like temperatures there. Precipitation levels, what kind of plant life do you see? Is it stuff that needs a lot of water, has a lot of water needs, or very small vegetation? Find a lot of like cactuses and things that usually live in the desert. Well, that tells you that you're probably looking at a period in Earth's history where at least at that location, there was not much precipitation, not much rain falling, okay? And as well, the atmospheric composition for the same reason. If there's lots of oxygen in the atmosphere, life is going to be going really well. If there's not a lot of oxygen, right? Think back to the Cambrian explosion. When there's not a lot of oxygen, life can't really thrive. So, especially bigger life, right? So, the bigger the life is, the more oxygen there needs to be in the atmosphere to support it. So, we found fossils of like centipedes that are like the size of my classroom, pretty much. Okay. That comes from a time when oxygen levels were very high. So, really big, ridiculous nightmare organisms could be supported. Oxygen levels are not that high anymore, so organisms that big do not really appear much. It's a waste of energy to be that big. Last thing for this, Kay, the Burgess Shale and its evidence of the Cambrian explosion. So remember back to the Cambrian explosion, that's where kind of, boom, suddenly overnight, life kind of went crazy, right? All of these complex organisms suddenly evolved. And it was because photosynthetic organisms evolved, right? Things that could do photosynthesis and produce oxygen. Cambrian explosion, suddenly a wide range of complex animals due to the increase in oxygen levels caused by the appearance of organisms that could do photosynthesis. Okay, this is kind of the first time that we start to see animals, really. Okay, before this, animals didn't really exist. We had bacteria, we had archaeans, we had protozoans. We didn't really have anything that we would call an animal, at least until this Cambrian explosion. Most of them can be traced back to then. Okay, the Burgess Shale is actually in BC. Okay, it's in Yoho National Park. It's a mountainside collection of a whole bunch of fossils. It's now on the mountain, but it used to be at the bottom of the ocean back during the Cambrian explosion. You can imagine it if you're a paleontologist or a geologist or anything or any scientist, really, right? But especially those ones. This is a super interesting time. The Cambrian explosion is kind of the origin of animals, right? It's really such an interesting time in our evolutionary history. So what happened essentially was there was a huge underwater landslide, an underwater avalanche, okay, of fine mud. It's like the perfect conditions to make a bunch of fossils. It's happening during the most interesting time in Earth's evolutionary history. It's fine mud, which remember we said makes really nice details in a fossil. Okay, they were all buried very quickly. So when you walk through the Burgess Shale, you can just like pick up a rock, and there's a pretty good chance it's going to have an incredibly detailed fossil of some very interesting organism from the Cambrian explosion era. So the Burgess Shale is world famous. It's the single most significant evolutionary transition period seen in the fossil record. So we can study so much of how life has evolved by looking at just this one set of fossils because the conditions were perfect. An underwater avalanche burying a whole bunch of things very quickly so they get preserved and burying them in fine sediments so that they're very detailed during this incredibly interesting time in evolutionary history. All right, I'm bringing these back up at the end now. So what are altered remains when we talk about fossils? What are unaltered remains? So what's the big difference between those two? What are trace fossils? What are the four main types of altered remains, or the four main ways that they get preserved? How do fossils tell us about the Earth's history, okay, in general? And what is the Burgess Shale? Okay, and if you're looking for practice with this, try out the topic 2 section of the practice for this week.